The morning mist hung low over the western bank of the Potomac River, 30 miles south of Washington, as the men of the 7th Massachusetts Volunteer Engineers prepared their pontoon bridges on July 16, 1862. Captain Samuel Baxter observed the far shore through his brass telescope, searching for any sign of Confederate pickets. The engineers had been tasked with establishing a crossing point for General Burnside's corps, part of a larger movement to pressure the Confederate forces from the west. What began as a routine bridging operation would uncover one of the more peculiar secrets of the early war years, a secret that would cast doubt on numerous battlefield reports and raise questions about the manufacturing standards of Southern artillery. According to regimental records dated July 16, the engineering company encountered no resistance as they completed the first 2 sections of their pontoon bridge. The weather was described as fair with moderate visibility, allowing the operation to proceed ahead of schedule. The company's log, maintained by Lieutenant David Marshall, notes that the 1st Infantry Scouts crossed at approximately 8:15 in the morning, securing a small area on the opposing bank near a wooded knoll overlooking a stretch of abandoned farmland. The scouts reported the presence of an artillery position that appeared to have been hastily abandoned, with a single iron cannon left behind. At 8:45, Captain Baxter crossed with a detail of 12 men to inspect the captured position. What they found puzzled them immediately. The gun was a 12-pounder field piece of unusual design, bearing no foundry marks that matched known Confederate arsenals. More curious still was the elaborate earthwork that had been constructed around it. A forward-facing parapet nearly 12 feet thick, reinforced with timber and iron railroad ties. Such fortification seemed excessive for a field position of its type. Upon closer examination, Lieutenant Thomas Cooper, the company's ordnance specialist, identified the piece as a modified 6-pounder with a rebored barrel to accommodate larger ammunition. The carriage showed signs of extensive repair and reinforcement, with iron bands wrapped around stress points and fresh wood replacements on the trail and axle. In Cooper's field notes, he observed that the piece appears to have suffered damage from excessive internal pressures, with visible deformation around the breech and evident hairline cracks extending forward. The real mystery emerged when Sergeant William Parker discovered a weathered leather satchel buried in the soft dirt beneath the gun position. Inside was a tattered notebook that appeared to be a firing log, though many pages had been damaged by water or deliberately removed. The remaining entries were written in a cramped, hurried hand, documenting test firings with precise measurements of powder charges, projectile weights, and observed impacts. Most entries were initialed JTG, with occasional annotations from Cole S. The most revealing entry, dated May 23, 1862, read, "Third test of reboard number 7 complete. Maximum effective range still not exceeding 600 yards, despite increased powder charge. Dangerous. Cole S. insists the Army of Northern Virginia must not be informed of the limitation. Orders to maintain illusion of standard range through calculated fire and strategic positioning. Gun crews to be informed only of their immediate firing solutions, never the true limitations." As Burnside's infantry began crossing in force, Captain Baxter ordered the firing log be sent immediately to division headquarters. Subsequent entries in the 7th Massachusetts Engineers records show the cannon was transported rearward for examination by ordnance officers from the Army of the Potomac. Here the documentary trail temporarily ends, with no official reports acknowledging the captured piece or its limitations in any headquarters correspondence from July or August 1862. Military archives contain records of charges brought against Captain George Reynolds of the 2nd Pennsylvania Volunteer Artillery for falsification of battlefield reports and conduct unbecoming an officer. While the specific details were marked as confidential, witness testimony references Reynolds' claims of having been fired upon by Confederate artillery from positions he estimated at approximately 1,400 yards distance during an engagement near the same river crossing in early July. The matter might have been forgotten entirely if not for an unusual court-martial proceeding that occurred in late September of that same year. The charges were ultimately dismissed due to insufficient evidence and consideration of the officer's prior exemplary service, but the timing and location suggest a connection to the discovery made by the 7th Massachusetts. More tellingly, Reynolds was reassigned from Field Command to an administrative position at the Washington Arsenal immediately following the court-martial. Meanwhile, the movements of JTG, likely Captain John Thomas Garraway, based on Confederate rosters from the period, reveal another layer to the story. Garraway served with the Richmond Howitzers until June 1862, when he was abruptly reassigned to the Confederate Ordnance Department in Richmond. A single surviving memorandum in the Confederate War Department archives, dated June 5th, references a transfer of Captain G following concerns regarding experimental artillery development unsuited for field deployment. The document bears the initials of Colonel Josiah Symington, a former U.S. Army officer who had joined the Confederate cause and whose expertise in artillery was widely respected. By early 1863, reports from Union signal officers monitoring Confederate artillery positions noted a distinct change in deployment patterns. In a February intelligence summary prepared for General Hooker, Major Albert Webb observed that enemy batteries have adopted a practice of establishing positions at closer ranges than military doctrine would suggest, particularly when confronting our forces across open ground. This tactical anomaly bears further scrutiny, as it may indicate ammunition conservation or other material limitations. The cannon itself disappears from official records until April 1863, when an inventory from the Washington Arsenal lists one captured 12 PDR of irregular manufacture among items designated for metallurgical analysis. The accompanying notes indicate that the barrel had been sectioned to examine its composition and construction, revealing inconsistent casting quality with significant air pockets and impurities in the breech area, rendering the piece unsafe for sustained firing at standard charges. What makes this discovery particularly significant is its timing and context within the larger struggle for industrial capacity between North and South. The Confederacy, lacking the manufacturing infrastructure of the Union, frequently resorted to improvised or modified weapons to maintain its artillery arm. The desperate measures taken to conceal the limitations of these weapons, requiring elaborate deception by gun crews and commanders, offers a glimpse into the psychological dimension of the material disparity between the opposing forces. One of the most telling documents comes from an unexpected source: the personal correspondence of Colonel Robert Harrison of the 4th Virginia Artillery, writing to his brother in Richmond in March 1863. In a letter that somehow escaped military censors, Harrison complained that our battery has been assigned 3 of the Richmond conversions, which the men have taken to calling 600 wonders for their refusal to throw shot an inch beyond that mark, despite all coaxing. Yet we are under orders to maintain the pretense of full-range capability, wasting powder on shots that can never reach and repositioning under cover of darkness to maintain the illusion. The effect on the men's morale cannot be overstated, as they feel they are playing at war rather than waging it. The psychological impact extended beyond the Confederate gun crews to Union forces as well. Multiple accounts from Union infantry officers throughout 1862 and early 1863 reference their frustration at being held in position beyond the range of their rifles while seemingly under artillery fire. Captain Hiram Scott of the 20th Maine wrote in his journal in December 1862, "The men grow restless when forced to endure the sound of rebel shells exploding several hundred yards before our position, all the while being ordered to maintain formation as if under effective fire. They are not fools, and recognize when they are being asked to respect a threat that cannot touch them." By mid-1863, the 600 Wonders appear to have been largely removed from frontline service in the Confederate Army. An ordnance return from the Army of Northern Virginia, dated July 2, shows a significant reduction in field pieces of irregular manufacture, with a corresponding increase in requisitions for imported Whitworth and Armstrong guns from England. The limitations of domestic production had become impossible to disguise on the battlefield, particularly against an enemy whose industrial capacity allowed for standardized, reliable artillery production. The story might have ended there, if not for the discovery in 1939 of a collection of papers belonging to Colonel Symington, found during renovation of a home in Charlottesville, Virginia. The document included technical specifications, production estimates, and most significantly, a section labeled Operational Considerations. This section candidly acknowledged the limited range capability of the converted weapons, but proposed a remarkable solution. As these pieces cannot achieve the standard range of proper 12-pounder guns, it is recommended that batteries equipped with conversions adopt deceptive firing practices to conceal this limitation from both the enemy and our own infantry. Among these papers was a manufacturing prospectus dated January 1862, for what was described as the Domestic Artillery Initiative, a program to convert obsolete 6-pounder guns to 12-pounder caliber through reboring. This includes establishing false battery positions at conventional distances while operating the conversions from concealed positions at effective range. Additionally, gun crews should be trained to execute coordinated fire with conventional artillery to create the impression of consistent range capability across all pieces. The document concluded with a chilling assessment. While the military disadvantage of limited range artillery is self-evident, there may be a psychological advantage in maintaining the appearance of artillery parity with the enemy. The effect of artillery on enemy morale often exceeds its actual destructive capability, particularly against inexperienced troops. The sound and smoke of artillery fire, even at ineffective range, may serve to fix enemy formations in place and deter aggressive movement. What emerges from these fragmented records is a picture of institutional deception that affected tactical decisions on both sides of the conflict. Union commanders, believing they faced effective Confederate artillery at conventional ranges, often hesitated to advance or altered their attack plans unnecessarily. Confederate batteries, struggling with weapons they knew to be inadequate, nevertheless maintained elaborate charades to project capability they did not possess. The human dimension of this deception is perhaps best captured in a letter written by Lieutenant James Wilson of the Richmond Howitzers to his wife in August 1862. "We performed our artillery demonstration as ordered today, firing round after round at an enemy we could see but not touch, while maintaining all the appearances of conducting effective fire. The men worked the guns with precision and professional pride, even as we all recognized the futility of our actions. It is a strange feeling to go through the motions of war without its substance, like actors in a grand and terrible play where only some of the dangers are real. The full extent of the 600 Wonder deception may never be known. Confederate records were notoriously incomplete by the war's end, with many destroyed during the fall of Richmond in 1865. What can be established is that the incident discovered by the 7th Massachusetts Engineers was not isolated, but part of a larger pattern of improvisation and deception necessitated by the Confederacy's industrial limitations. The story of the 600-yard cannon illuminates a lesser-known aspect of Civil War combat, the psychological warfare conducted through the manipulation of perceived capabilities. In a conflict often characterized by direct and brutal confrontation, this episode reveals a more nuanced battlefield where perception and reality diverged in ways that affected both strategy and morale. Military historians examining these incidents have noted the parallel to similar deceptions practiced in later conflicts, where armies with material disadvantages employed elaborate measures to project strength they did not possess. The Confederate artillery deception, while ultimately unsustainable as the war progressed, demonstrates the extent to which psychological factors were recognized and exploited by military leaders of the era. As for the cannon that started this investigation, its final disposition remains unclear. The sectioned barrel examined at the Washington Arsenal was reportedly transferred to the newly established U.S. Military Academy Museum in 1864 as an example of Confederate manufacturing limitations, but no such exhibit appears in museum catalogues from the period. Like many artifacts of the war, it may have been relegated to storage or repurposed as the nation turned its attention to healing rather than studying its recent wounds. What survived instead was the story, passed down through veterans' accounts, preserved in fragmented records, and eventually reconstructed by military historians. The tale of the cannon that couldn't reach became part of the folkloric understanding of the conflict among those who had experienced it firsthand, a reminder that war consists not only of what happens on the battlefield, but what combatants believe is happening. In a report prepared for the War Department in 1866, analyzing the lessons of artillery employment during the conflict, Colonel Henry Jackson wrote, "The effectiveness of artillery in modern warfare cannot be measured solely by its physical impact. The psychological effect of artillery fire, or even the mere threat of such fire, often exceeds the actual destruction it causes." It was observed on numerous occasions that infantry formations would refuse to advance across ground they believed to be covered by enemy guns, even when subsequent analysis revealed such coverage to be impossible due to range limitations or terrain features. The mind creates dangers that powder and shot alone cannot. Captain Samuel Baxter of the 7th Massachusetts Engineers returned to civilian life after the war, becoming a professor of mechanical engineering at the newly established Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In lecture notes from 1871, he referenced the captured cannon as an example of the compromise between appearance and function that often characterizes engineering under resource constraints. He observed that the Confederate solution, while fundamentally unsound from a purely technical perspective, demonstrated an understanding of human psychology that temporarily offset their material disadvantage. The lesson for engineers is clear. The perceived capabilities of a system may, in certain circumstances, be as important as its actual performance. Lieutenant Thomas Cooper, who had identified the modified nature of the cannon, pursued a career in armaments design after the war. Patents filed in his name during the 1870s show a preoccupation with improving the strength and reliability of artillery barrels, particularly in managing the pressures generated by increasingly powerful propellants. In a paper presented to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers in 1878, he wrote, "The failure modes observed in captured Confederate ordnance during the late war provided invaluable insights into the consequences of expedient modification without corresponding improvements in material strength." These lessons have informed modern design principles regarding the reinforcement of breech sections and the gradual transition of barrel thickness along the bore axis. The men who operated the limited-range cannons left fewer records of their experiences. Confederate artillery veterans rarely discussed the deceptions in which they had participated. perhaps out of professional pride or lingering loyalty to their cause. Occasional references appear in pension applications and veterans' gatherings, where terms like short shooters or appearance guns were mentioned with a mixture of humor and resignation. One exception was Sergeant Major Thomas Edwards of the 1st Virginia Artillery, who published a memoir in 1890 titled 4 Years Behind the Guns. In a brief passage, he recalled, "There were certain pieces in our battery that the men knew would never strike beyond a specified distance, though we were instructed to fire them as if they had full range. We became expert at creating the impression of effectiveness, using careful observation of where our limited shots fell to adjust our aim as if we were walking fire onto distant targets. The infantry believed in our protection, and we did not discourage their faith, though between ourselves we knew the truth. It was a deception born of necessity rather than choice, and I cannot say whether it served our cause or prolonged a conflict we could not win." The final chapter of this story came in 1942 when a construction project at the former site of the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond uncovered a small cache of documents that had been sealed in a copper box within a cornerstone. Among them was a manufacturing order dated March 1862 for 24 barrel reinforcement bands for converted field pieces, with a marginal note reading, "Priority project per coloness, to be completed regardless of material quality." The appearance of strength must be maintained, even where strength itself cannot be achieved. This last document perhaps best encapsulates the fundamental challenge faced by the Confederacy throughout the war: the necessity of projecting military capability that its industrial base could not sustainably provide. The 600-yard cannon, with its elaborate deceptions and psychological impact, stands as a tangible example of how this disparity shaped the conduct of the war on both sides. In the end, no amount of deception could overcome the fundamental material advantages enjoyed by Union forces. The industrial capacity that allowed the North to produce standardized, reliable artillery in large quantities eventually rendered the Confederate artillery deceptions obsolete. By 1864, improved Union field intelligence and battle experience had largely nullified the psychological impact of the appearance guns, as units became increasingly adept at distinguishing between effective and ineffective fire. Yet for a critical period in the middle years of the war, perception and reality diverged in ways that influenced battlefield decisions and possibly extended the conflict. The story of the cannon that couldn't shoot past 600 yards reminds us that war is fought not only with weapons, but with information, deception, and the manipulation of belief. In this psychological dimension of conflict, the Confederacy briefly achieved a form of parity that their factories could not provide. Today, the only known surviving example of what might have been one of these converted six-pounders rests in a small museum in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Unlabeled, except as a Confederate field piece, its quiet presence offers no hint of the elaborate deception of which it was once a part. Like many aspects of the Civil War, the full truth lies scattered across fragmented records, personal accounts, and the faded memories of those who lived through the conflict. A mosaic of history that can never be completely reassembled, but continues to offer insights into the nature of warfare and human psychology under the pressures of existential struggle. The fog of war, it seems, can be deliberately thickened by those who understand that battles are won and lost, not only through the physical clash of armies, but through the perceptions that guide commanders' decisions and sustain soldiers' morale. In this shadow conflict of appearance versus reality, the 600-yard cannon played its role, a prop in the theater of war that for a time convinced its audience that the performance they witnessed was something other than what it truly was. As artillery techniques evolved in later conflicts, military planners would continue to draw on the lessons of perception management demonstrated by these Confederate improvisations. The fundamental insight that the psychological impact of weapons can sometimes exceed their physical effect would influence the development of battlefield deception from the trenches of World War I to the electronic countermeasures of modern combat. In this way, the legacy of the 600-yard cannon extends far beyond its limited physical range, reaching across decades of military thought to the present day. Lieutenant David Marshall, whose regimental log first recorded the discovery of the cannon, perhaps summarized it best in a letter to his brother written in 1890. "Of all the weapons I encountered during the war, the most powerful was neither rifle nor cannon, but the human capacity to believe what we expect to see, rather than what truly lies before us." Both armies wielded this weapon, though perhaps the Confederates, through necessity rather than choice, became its most skilled practitioners. "The cannon that couldn't shoot taught me that in war, as in life, we are often governed less by facts than by our perception of them." In military academies today, the case of the 600-yard cannon is occasionally cited in courses on military deception and the psychological aspects of warfare. The lesson drawn is not merely historical but practical. The battlefield exists not only in physical space, but in the minds of those who fight upon it. Perception can be a force multiplier, or, as in this case, a means of compensating for material deficiency. The ultimate failure of the Confederate deception underscores another truth, that while psychological warfare can temporarily offset material disadvantage, it cannot indefinitely substitute for industrial capacity and logistical strength. For the men of the 7th Massachusetts Volunteer Engineers, who discovered the cannon on that July morning in 1862, the implications of their find would not have been immediately apparent. They saw only an abandoned gun with unusual modifications and a mysteriously thick parapet. The larger pattern of deception and its effects on the conduct of the war would emerge only gradually through the accumulation of similar incidents, intelligence reports, and captured documents. That they recognized the significance of the firing log found buried beneath the gun position speaks to the professional curiosity and attention to detail that characterized many of the volunteer officers who served in the Union Army. Captain Baxter's decision to forward the document immediately to division headquarters reflected an understanding that information, even seemingly technical details about an enemy weapon's limitations, could have strategic value. What none of them could have known was how their discovery would eventually illuminate not just a single Confederate artillery piece, but an entire approach to warfare born of industrial disparity. In this, their experience mirrors the larger process by which military understanding develops, through the accumulation of observations, the recognition of patterns, and the gradual reconstruction of intent from fragmentary evidence. The 600-yard cannon, in the end, was more than just a weapon with limited range. It was a tangible manifestation of the Confederacy's broader strategic challenge: how to sustain the appearance of military parity with an opponent whose industrial capacity far exceeded their own. The deception surrounding these weapons represented a creative, if ultimately futile, attempt to address this fundamental imbalance through the manipulation of perception. That the deception worked at all, and for as long as it did, offers insight into the nature of battlefield intelligence in the era before aerial reconnaissance and electronic surveillance. Union commanders, operating with incomplete information and often overestimating enemy capabilities, made decisions based on perceived threats that shaped the course of battles and campaigns. Confederate leaders, aware of this dynamic, allocated scarce resources to maintaining these perceptions, even when they could not maintain the capabilities themselves. In the end, reality asserted itself, as it inevitably does in warfare. The industrial might of the North, coupled with improving intelligence and battlefield experience, eventually rendered the artillery deceptions ineffective. But for a critical period in the middle years of the war, perception and reality existed in a complex relationship that influenced the decisions of commanders on both sides. The story of the 600-yard cannon stands as a reminder that war is fought not only with weapons, but with information, deception, and belief. In the psychological dimension of conflict, appearances can temporarily substitute for capabilities, but they cannot indefinitely replace them. The ultimate lesson, perhaps, is that while the mind can be deceived, the material realities of warfare eventually assert themselves, a truth that has held from the fields of the Civil War to the battlegrounds of the present day. In this light, the discovery made by the 7th Massachusetts engineers on that July morning was more than just a curious anecdote from a long-ago conflict. It was a window into the psychological complexity of warfare, the relationship between perception and reality on the battlefield, and the creative adaptations forced upon combatants by material necessity. These insights, gleaned from fragmented records and personal accounts, continue to inform our understanding of military deception and its limitations, connecting the past to the present through the enduring principles of human psychology under the pressures of war. In the decades following the war, periodic rediscoveries of documents relating to the 600 Wonders continued to add dimensions to the story. A collection of artillery drill manuals found in the attic of a Richmond courthouse in 1944 contained a supplementary pamphlet marked "Confidential for battery commanders only." Dated October 1862, it outlined procedures for simulated long-range fire, instructing gun crews to maintain all the formal procedures of range calculation and elevation adjustment even when firing the limited-range pieces. More telling was the instruction that battery commanders will ensure that all gun crews maintain the appearance of effective fire through coordinated observation and adjustment, regardless of actual impact capability. The pamphlet included specific guidance on how to create the impression of effective long-range fire. When employing limited-range pieces against distant targets, fire should be coordinated with adjacent batteries equipped with standard ordnance. Smoke and concussion will blend, preventing enemy observers from distinguishing between effective and ineffective fire. Limited-range pieces should be fired slightly after standard pieces to create the impression of continuous impact across the target area. Perhaps most remarkable was the section addressing the psychological management of the gun crews themselves. As the limitations of these weapons may affect the morale of artillery personnel, commanders should emphasize the critical role these pieces play in our overall fire plan. The ability to present the appearance of greater artillery strength than actually exists is a valuable contribution to our defensive capability. Gun crews should understand that they are not merely going through the motions, but actively contributing to enemy deception. Further evidence of the psychological impact of these weapons emerged from the diary of Major Edward Thornton of the 18th Virginia Infantry, discovered among family papers in 1939. In an entry dated September 1862, he wrote, "The men continue to express discontent regarding artillery support. During yesterday's advance, O'Malley's company took cover when shells began falling short of our position, believing them to be ranging shots that would soon find their mark. They remained pinned for nearly 20 minutes before Captain Harris rode up and informed me that those were the actual impacts, not ranging shots, and that we should continue the advance." The men moved forward with great reluctance, having been conditioned to respect artillery fire that now posed no actual threat. "I fear our own deceptions have begun to undermine confidence between the infantry and artillery arms." The strategic implications of the deception extended beyond individual engagements. In a memorandum prepared for General Lee in November 1862, discovered in Army archives in 1935, Colonel E.P. Alexander, his artillery chief, addressed the sustainability of the artillery deception. While the employment of limited-range conversions has temporarily provided the appearance of artillery sufficiency, this approach carries increasing risk as the enemy gains battlefield experience. Instances have already occurred where Union forces have advanced into what they previously believed to be covered zones, discovering the ineffectiveness of our fire only through practical experience. This trend will accelerate as their junior officers become more discerning regarding the visual and auditory signatures of effective versus ineffective fire. Alexander went on to recommend a fundamental shift in strategy. Rather than dispersing our limited supply of proper artillery pieces to maintain the appearance of uniform capability across all batteries, we should consider concentrating effective guns in key positions where their fire can be decisive. The current policy of mixing limited and full-range pieces in all batteries, while creating the impression of greater overall strength, dilutes our actual firepower where it might be most needed. This recommendation appears to have influenced Confederate artillery deployment in 1863, with ordnance returns showing a more concentrated distribution of imported Whitworth and Armstrong guns among select batteries, rather than the previous pattern of even distribution. This shift coincided with a reduction in references to 600 wonders in Confederate correspondence, suggesting that the deception was gradually abandoned as its effectiveness diminished. The human cost of maintaining the deception was captured in a letter written by Lieutenant Harold Jenkins of the Washington Artillery to his father in January 1863. "We conducted another demonstration yesterday, firing repeatedly at Union positions we knew to be beyond our range. The men performed admirably, going through all the motions of sighting, elevation adjustment, and recoil management, as if engaged in effective fire. Afterward, I overheard Sergeant Collins remark that he felt like a musician playing a violin with no strings, making all the proper movements while producing no actual music. It is a peculiar form of warfare where appearance substitutes for effect, and I wonder how long such illusions can be maintained before reality asserts itself." On the Union side, the gradual recognition of the Confederate artillery limitations led to tactical adaptations. A field circular issued to brigade commanders in the Army of the Potomac in March 1863, preserved in the personal papers of General John Sedgwick, advised, "Recent experience indicates that Confederate artillery fire often fails to reach effective range despite the appearance of active engagement. Brigade commanders should instruct their skirmish lines to carefully observe the actual impact areas of enemy artillery, rather than assuming effectiveness based on sound and smoke alone. Advances should proceed with appropriate caution, but not be unnecessarily delayed by artillery demonstrations that may be more show than substance." This growing awareness among Union forces effectively neutralized much of the psychological impact that had been the primary value of the limited-range pieces. By mid-1863, Confederate battery commanders were increasingly reporting that Union infantry would advance boldly into zones they had previously approached with extreme caution, having learned through experience that the threat was largely illusory. A letter from Colonel William Pendleton to the Confederate Secretary of War in June 1863, uncovered during archive reorganization in 1942, acknowledged the diminishing returns of the deception. The expedient of employing converted ordnance with limited capability, while initially providing some tactical advantage through the manipulation of enemy perception, has now largely lost its effectiveness. Union forces have become adept at distinguishing between threat and effect, advancing confidently into areas where our fire presents more noise than danger. I respectfully suggest that remaining pieces of this type be withdrawn from frontline service and replaced with proper artillery as it becomes available, or the batteries be consolidated to maximize the effect of our limited supply of standard pieces. The story of the 600-yard cannon illuminates a broader historical pattern in which military organizations facing material disadvantages resort to deception to project capabilities they do not possess. From Quaker guns, logs painted to resemble cannons, used by both sides during the American Revolution and Civil War, to the inflatable tanks and aircraft of Operation Fortitude during World War II, armies have long understood that the appearance of strength can sometimes be leveraged to compensate for actual weakness. What distinguishes the case of the rebored Confederate cannon is the institutional nature of the deception. This was not a field expedient solution developed by individual commanders, but a systematic program directed from the highest levels of the Confederate Ordnance Department. It represented a calculated decision to invest limited resources in maintaining the appearance of artillery parity, rather than concentrating those resources to achieve actual parity in specific sectors. The psychological dimension of this strategy reveals a sophisticated understanding of how perception influences military decision-making. By maintaining the appearance of effective long-range artillery, Confederate leaders temporarily succeeded in constraining Union movements and forcing caution where aggression might have been possible. This approach recognized that commanders make decisions based not on the actual capabilities of enemy forces, but on their perception of those capabilities, filtered through incomplete intelligence and the fog of war. Yet the case also demonstrates the inherent limitations of deception as a substitute for material capability. As the war progressed and Union forces gained experience, the psychological effect diminished, and the reality of Confederate artillery limitations became increasingly apparent. Deception proved to be a wasting asset, effective primarily against inexperienced troops and commanders, but gradually neutralized by battlefield learning. A final epilogue to this story appeared in a technical report prepared by the U.S. Ordnance Department in 1868, analyzing captured Confederate artillery. The report included metallurgical analysis of several rebored 6-pounder barrels, concluding the attempt to convert these pieces to larger caliber was fundamentally unsound from an engineering perspective. The original casting was inadequate to withstand the increased pressures, leading to progressive metal fatigue and increasing risk of catastrophic failure with each firing. That these weapons were employed at all speaks to the desperate material circumstances facing Confederate forces, and their limited effective range represents not a design choice, but an inescapable physical constraint imposed by insufficient barrel strength. The report went on to estimate that approximately 70 to 90 such conversions were performed during the middle period of the war, with most being withdrawn from service by late 1863 as their limitations became widely recognized by Union forces, and their deceptive value correspondingly diminished. This figure aligns with the scattered references in Confederate ordnance returns and correspondence, suggesting that while not numerically significant compared to the total Confederate artillery park, these pieces played a distinctive role in the psychological dimension of the conflict. For the men of the 7th Massachusetts Engineers, who discovered that first converted cannon in July 1862, the broader implications of their find would only become apparent in the decades that followed, as the fragmented story was gradually pieced together from scattered records and personal accounts. Captain Samuel Baxter, in his later academic career, occasionally referred to the incident in lectures on the relationship between engineering constraints and military effectiveness, citing it as an example of how technical limitations shape battlefield behavior. Lieutenant Thomas Cooper, whose identification of the cannon's modified nature provided the first clue to its unusual history, maintained a professional interest in artillery design throughout his post-war career. In a technical paper published in 1880, he reflected, "The attempt to extend the capability of light field pieces through barrel conversion revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between pressure, metal strength, and effective range. The resulting limitations forced the adoption of deceptive practices that, while temporarily effective in psychological terms, ultimately undermined confidence in artillery support among infantry formations." The lesson for modern ordnance design is clear. Appearance cannot long substitute for actual capability, and engineering compromises that sacrifice performance for production expediency will eventually be exposed under field conditions. Perhaps the most poignant reflection on the 600-yard cannon came from Brigadier General E.P. Alexander, writing in his post-war memoir, Military Memoirs of a Confederate in 1907, "Among the many improvisations forced upon us by material necessity, none better illustrates both the ingenuity and the fundamental constraints under which we operated than the attempt to convert obsolete field pieces to larger caliber. In retrospect, we might have better served our cause by acknowledging our limitations and adapting our tactics accordingly, rather than creating illusions that could not be sustained as the enemy gained experience." Alexander's observation captures the essential tragedy of the Confederate artillery deception, that in attempting to compensate for material weakness through psychological means, the Confederate leadership may have ultimately undermined the confidence of their own forces in artillery support. The limited range these conversions could safely achieve led to elaborate deceptions regarding their capability, temporarily influencing Union tactical decisions, but ultimately creating a false sense of security among our own forces. The illusion, once recognized as such, diminished not only the perceived threat to Union forces, but also the morale effect on Confederate infantry who had believed themselves protected by effective long-range fire. Today, the story of the 600-yard cannon serves as a case study in the complex relationship between technology, psychology, and battlefield effectiveness. It reminds us that warfare is conducted not only through the exchange of fire, but through the management of perception, and that deception, while a powerful tool, carries its own costs and limitations. The cannon that couldn't shoot beyond 600 yards, with its elaborate surrounding deceptions, stands as a tangible example of how material constraints shape not only the physical, but also the psychological dimension of conflict. As for the original cannon discovered by the 7th Massachusetts engineers, its ultimate fate remains uncertain. The sectioned barrel studied at the Washington Arsenal was reportedly transferred to West Point, but no clear record of its arrival or subsequent display exists. Like many artifacts of the war, it may have been lost to time, its physical presence less enduring than the story it inspired, a story of ingenuity, deception, and the complex interplay between perception and reality on the fields of battle. In the final analysis, the 600-yard cannon represents more than just a technical curiosity or a footnote in military history. It embodies the desperate creativity of an outmatched force, the psychological dimensions of industrial disparity, and the limits of deception as a substitute for material capability. Its story, pieced together from fragmented records and personal accounts across decades, offers insights that transcend its specific historical context, speaking to enduring questions about the nature of warfare and the human factors that shape its conduct. The cannon's limited range and the elaborate deceptions constructed around it remind us that in war, as in other human endeavors, we are constrained not only by the tools we possess, but by the perceptions we create and maintain, and that neither can long diverge from reality without consequence.